Let's look at the features that are used to identify ferns. And as I recall, ferns have a dominant sporophyte, which is the leafy part of the fern. The leaves are often curled up when they're in the bud in a sort of shape of a fiddle's head. The sporangia are often aggregated into clusters called sori on the undersurfaces of leaves. And oh, by the way, the sporangia, very small they often have a belt of tissue called the annulus, which splits open the sporangium and releases the spores when it sort of reflexes back. There are three main features that are used to differentiate ferns. They're called frond form, frond dissection type, and indusium type. Frond form, that has to do with whether or not normal-looking foliage leaves bear spores, or whether wholly different leaves bear spores, or whether parts of leaves bear spores. And the type of fern that you'd actually have to look at the undersurface of the leaves to see if in fact it's bearing spores, because there's no difference between the spore-bearing leaves and the vegetative ones, is called monomorphic. It means one form. So in these two ferns shown here, the leaves all look about the same, but on some of them, the undersurfaces contain sori. Monomorphic. Some ferns are holodimorphic, which means completely dimorphic, with fertile fronds that are wholly and completely modified to the production of spores. And in the cinnamon fern here, it's these ones that look like cinnamon sticks. And the other leaves that are completely vegetative, not spore producing. Sometimes they're called fertile and sterile, respectively. And a third, which is sort of like intermediate between the two. So this picture here of this rattlesnake fern shows one leaf, and the bottom portion of the leaf is leafy, photosynthetic, not producing spores, but a different portion of the leaf, this fertile portion, is the spore-bearing part, and that's called hemidimorphic. So here's an example of three ferns that are actually closely related. The middle one and the left one are hemidimorphic with fertile leaflets, and the one on the right is holodimorphic with fertile and sterile fronds. By the way, the left is called interrupted fern, the middle is called royal fern, and the right is called cinnamon fern. Another thing has to do with how divided the leaves are. You can think of leaves as being simple or compound, and that's sometimes very elaborate in ferns, and so it's developed a special nomenclature. So, a fern that is not at all parted or divided or cleft is called entire. So it's not deeply lobed. And this walking fern has an entire frond dissection type. If the leaves are deeply, deeply lobed, but they don't quite expose bare leaf stalk or rachis beneath, if it's just deeply lobed but not completely parted, that is called pinnatophyid. It's kind of like the word pinnate, but with a little diminutive suffix there, pinnatophyid. And this fern, called polypody, is pinnatophyid. If, however, the leaves are fully and completely divided into leaflets, as shown here, but the leaflets themselves are not particularly divided or cleft, that's called pinnate, feathery, pinnate. If the leaf, of which there's a portion shown here, is fully and completely divided into leaflets, of which I'm circling a leaflet, and the leaflets are not quite divided, that is called pinnate, pinnatophyid. The leaves are pinnate and the leaflets are pinnatophyid. And carrying this a little bit further, if the leaves are fully and completely divided into leaflets, which are fully and completely divided into subleaflets, that's called bipinnate. And this is spinulous wood fern, which is bipinnate. And that can be carried out to be bipinnate, pinnatifid, and tripinnate. Another thing that differentiates ferns has to do with the sporangia. Now here's a little technical difference that you usually don't need to carefully discern, but it turns out that there are two different types of sporangia. There are big, what are called eusporangia, which means true sporangia. Not to say that the leptosporangia, the other kind, is false, but it's how the term's developed. So this group of ferns that includes the grape ferns, they have these really, really big sporangia that don't have that annulus I referred to before. They're sort of globular. So this is a picture of a rattlesnake fern. No indusium, really big sori. Here they are before they've released their spores. And here they are when many of them have released their spores. Okay. Another type of sporangium, the one that's more common and although less easy to see, is called the leptosporangiate ferns. So each one of these little aggregates here is a sporangium, and they're aggregated into sori, groups of them. And hopefully you can see in this image that they have this belt of tissue called the annulus. They're very small, these sporangia, so we usually look at the way in which they're aggregated. So there is a flap of tissue that covers the sori when they're developing, and it's called an indusium. Sometimes it's more obvious to tell than others, and the shape of the indusium is kind of reflective of the shape of the sorus, so we refer to as the indusium type or the sorus type, sometimes semi-interchangeably. But this particular fern, called Christmas fern, it has a flap of tissue covering the sporangia. It's actually circular, and you can't see because it's underneath, but it's attached in the center. It's like an umbrella. It's called peltate. They're kind of like mushroom shaped. And these peltate indusia are fairly distinctive. It's a nice feature of Christmas fern. Now, here's some others that are differentiated by their shape. So these sori, also the indusia, are long and narrow. And several ferns can be recognized by their long, narrow, linear indusia, like this glade fern. And several other ferns have indusia that are linear, maybe a little bit thick, like this one. Sort of linear. You can see the linear indusium. Okay. Another shape of the indusium is kidney-shaped. So you can see this indusium, I'm trying to draw it here, is circular, but it has a cleft on one side. The kidney-shaped or reniform, which means kidney-shaped indusium of crested wood fern, several other ferns that are called wood ferns, and some others too, such as marsh fern and New York fern, have a reniform indusium. Another type of indusium is called a false indusium. So rather than being a separate flap of tissue that's on the blade of the leaf that covers the sori when they're developing, is a situation where the sori develop very close to the margin of the leaf. And these photos are showing the undersurface of the fern, and the margin of the leaf is curled under and folds on top of the developing sori and sort of acts like an indusium. It's a false indusium because it's not a separate flap of tissue, but it's the margin of the leaf. In this particular fern, this cliff break, it has what's called a false continuous indusium because it's the entire margin of the leaf, the complete margin of the leaf that folds under the indusia. Here's an example of another fern with a false indusium. You can't quite see the sori underneath that, but look how sharply this leaf margin is turned under. And beneath there are developing sporangia. And this one, because it's broken up into little segments, it's called a discontinuous false indusium. And that is a distinctive feature of some ferns, the false indusium. The leaf margin curls under and covers the sori when they're developing. Some ferns don't have any flap of tissue, any indusium. It has a naked sorus. And this fern, which is called polypody, is an example of a fern with a naked sorus. This is another picture of the peltate indusia. It's showing a lot of these young sporangia of Christmas fern. And here's Christmas fern gametophytes. And here's the top portion of the Christmas fern showing that it has a hemidimorphic frond type, where these suddenly sharply smaller leaflets are the ones that bear spores, and the other ones below are the vegetative ones. So those are the three features that we use to differentiate ferns: frond form, frond dissection type, and indusium type. Happy fern hunting!